Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 30th and last meeting of 2012 of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Members and the public should turn off their mobile phones and their Blackberries, as leaving them in flight mode or on silent will affect the broadcasting system. And we turn now to agenda item 1. We welcome Jane Baxter to the committee and ask her if she has to declare any relevant interests.
Chair, no, I don't have any relevant interests that I need to declare. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Well, we welcome Jane to the committee. We have had some changes of personnel. We hope that you're here for a long time, like the rest of us. But we keep getting a photograph, and we have to change the photograph almost monthly. So let's hope that's at an end. But welcome. And we would like to thank Margaret McDougall formally for her work when she was on the committee prior to Jane's arrival. We move on to agenda item 2 now, which is subordinate legislation. And this item today is for the committee to consider 4 negative instruments as listed on the agenda. And members should note that no motion to annul has been received in relation to these instruments, and I refer members to the paper. Are there any comments to be made by any members just now? There are 4 items, 2 of which are corrections. The first of which requires some corrections. The complexity, I think, of some of these particular areas of regulation are something we note. Indeed, we've had mention from the Rural Affairs Division about the welfare of animals at the time of killing. Scotland Regulations, SSI 2012-321, and they intend to amend 2 paragraphs in that, as far as I understand, very rapidly after the new year. But thanks to the Sub-Leg Committee for bringing it to the attention of the government, so therefore we get better regulation in that respect. Any other comments from members? Yes, Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. It's really just to highlight that as a member of the cross-party group for animal welfare, that there have been a number of concerns raised about it, and I think it's important that there is ongoing discussion and awareness of the issue of animals at the time of killing. So I really just I would like that noted, just that there are ongoing concerns still, which I won't go into today, but they still exist.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Are we agreed that we don't need to make any further mention of these orders? Agreed? Thank you very much. We now move on to agenda item 3, which is the Aquaculture-and-Fisheries Scotland Bill. And this is our 4th evidence session on the bill, and today we'll have a roundtable discussion on parts 3 and 4 of the bill. Parts 3 and 4 of the bill relate to sea fisheries and shellfish. And we have our panellists joining us, the committee. So I wonder if we could just introduce ourselves as we go around the table. Jane Baxter's our first MSP. Thereafter.
My name's Craig Burton, and I'm from the Seafish Industry Authority.
I'm Claudia Beamish, MSP.
I'm Stephen Cameron, the Managing Director of the Scottish Shellfish Marketing Group.
Richard Lyle, MSP.
Jennifer Howie from the Food Standards Agency in Scotland.
Nigel Dawn, MSP.
Walter Spears, currently Chairman of the Association of Scottish Shellfish Growers and also Chair of the Scottish Government Shellfish Forum, and also have a mussel farm in Lochetive, which you've heard about previously in regard to Michaelis trossilus.
Alex Ferguson, MSP.
Peter Pollard from the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, SEPA.
Jim Hume, MSP.
David McCallum, Dumfries and Galloway Constabulary.
Angus MacDonald, MSP.
Graham Day, MSP.
And I'm Rob Gibson, the convener, SMSP convener. In order that the discussion flows and allows everyone to contribute, witnesses and members should indicate to me when they wish to speak, and everyone should make an effort to keep contributions as concise as possible, please. So we're going to begin the questions on the general level of consultation on the bill and the Scottish Government response. There are a lot of issues raised in the consultation which some of you may have wished to see brought forward to the bill and which were not included. What were the issues for you, if any, and are they going to be taken forward in other ways? Yes, Walter Spears.
Very much welcome the provision in the bill for the protection of shellfish growing waters going forward. There is a bit of detail that we need to make sure follows through on the general spirit of the detail that's in the bill.
Okay. Any particular?
Well, I think the specifics for the biological standards or the microbiological standards for shellfish growing waters, we have the desire to protect them, but we just need to know exactly what the standards are going to be.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that? Okay, we have made a start with looking at issues which may be taken forward. Clearly, we as members gathering information will be making our recommendations in the first stage report, which goes forward after we've completed this, about the overall view that we've taken. But let's move on then to the next question, which Jim Hume is going to lead on, to do with seizure of vessels and things, inspections. Jim Hume.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, Section 34 of this bill gives powers to enforce officers to inspect objects connected with commercial sea fisheries and, of course, perhaps seize them. Seafish raised a point that regarding inspections and seizures, stating that conducting research should be exempted. I just wonder from some of the panel members if this has been raised with the government and what the government's response was to that.
My goodness, we're having a quiet session today. Yes, please, Craig Burton.
The reason we raise it is obviously we conduct real-time research on commercial vessels using gear that may or may not be legal under the current requirements, and we're very keen to just make sure that it's clarified before the bill goes forward so there's no ambiguity for the enforcement officers.
Government?
We've heard nothing at all from it.
No. And okay, so just regarding other witnesses, regarding inspections and seizures, and Section 34, does any of the other panel guests today have comment on the proposed new powers? Perhaps the police may be interested to be.
I don't think that's one that the police would do in terms of boats themselves. We clearly don't have the capacity or capability at this moment in time to examine boats. So it would be very difficult for us in respect of sea fishing.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Any other questions in that section just now? No? Right. Well, moving on to the modification of the Fisheries Act 1981, enforcement of EU rules. We have a question here from Graham Day.
Thank you. Good morning. Accepting that the Scottish Government plans a minor amendment to the proposals to take in shore-based trades, do any of the witnesses foresee any practical problems in implementing the planned changes?
Okay, nobody seems to have a problem with that. Right, well, maybe we'll have more help with the shellfish section of our questions. We're always keen to hear from people if they have second thoughts at a later stage, but I'm sure there'll be plenty to say as we move into this. A question from, first of all, Dick Lyle.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can I ask if there will be any practical difficulties integrating the designation and de-designation of shellfish areas within the River Basin Management Plan process? Do you see any dangers in moving this from a 3-year cycle to a 6-year cycle?
I think as long as we have the protection in place, That's the main thing. The protection we want will be one of non-deterioration. So as long as the waters are monitored and any deterioration is dealt with, I don't see any real problem in moving to a change of cycle time.
Sipa, have a view?
I think moving to a planning cycle that aligns with how we manage the water environment as a whole makes a lot of sense to us. It means that we can manage our investment processes, planning processes in a coordinated fashion for delivering the protection that shellfish sector needs. And the other part of that is each risk of deterioration we assess on a case-by-case basis at the time of an application is made, for example, for a discharge.
Stephen Cameron?
Yeah, just to sort of reiterate from a commercial angle, both Walter and Peter's point, the continuation of the strive to have grade A waters for growing shellfish is particularly important from a commercial angle. And whilst that classification is subject to interpretation of EU legislation, we really must ensure that we protect the commercial status of grade A water. It is very important for our industry.
Anyone else on that point just now? Okay. Claudia Beamish?
And good morning to everybody. Could I take that line of discussion a little further with everybody? Are there any circumstances from SEPA's point of view where they might decide that protection of areas is not commercially justified? We've had evidence about that. And as well, just to open the discussion further from other panel members, could this have a detrimental effect on any smaller shellfish cultivators?
Peter Pollard.
I think the main thrust of the proposal to replace the Shellfish Waters Directive provisions is to give flexibility to decide when investment in improvement is proportionate. So it's a risk-based approach, which action is proportionate, taking account of cost and benefits. So safeguarding the areas from deterioration, fine, but actually making sure we have flexibility to consider costs and benefits, because there are big costs to moving polluted water up to Class A, and we need to factor that in to the decision making. So that greater flexibility is important.
Walter Spears?
I think I'd just like to add to that one thing we're not clear about is who's going to make that judgment on the cost-benefit analysis. I think in the very extreme case, we would accept that to spend millions upgrading a sewage plant for a very small output shellfish farm wouldn't make sense. But we're certainly not clear as to how that cost-benefit judgment would be made and who we would work with or negotiate that through. So it is a little bit vague as to how we'd manage that. But I think moving forward, I think there are areas which are suitable at the moment for shellfish cultivation which are not being used, and if we can protect those areas from deterioration, that's been one of our main drivers, is to protect things from deterioration. When it comes to cleaning up areas, then that is all part of the River Basin Management Plan and part of the ongoing drive. So it's really, for us, it's about non-deterioration and then continuous improvement.
Jennifer Howie.
I would just like to make the point that, I mean, looking at the data that we collect in terms of our monitoring, ongoing monitoring of classified shellfish production areas, the waters in Scotland are of a good standard. We can see it with the number of A-class waters that we have, but the margins between A's and B's are very small. I mean, we have lochs where there are no wastewater treatment works at all, but they're not A-class waters all year round, simply because of the nature of the loch and the usage round about the loch, the septic tanks that are declared and non-declared, the leisure uses. You can't guarantee absolutely that you'll get an A-class water just because investment's been made. Any amount of investment, I would say, because you could have very unusual weather events that are becoming less unusual now, for example, and exceptionally high runoff from the land into the water. So I would just like to make the point that Class A, I would doubt you could say categorically you can guarantee it under any circumstances.
We had hoped to have Scottish Water here today to discuss this with us, but they weren't able to be present. So we will alert them to this evidence and seek further views from them. Indeed. Yes, Walter Spears.
Just like to add to what Jenny said. I mean, I think in the shellfish sector we have the Growing Waters Directive, which is the one that's going to be replaced now in this new bill. And then we have the Shellfish Harvesting Waters Directive, which is what Food Standards Agency look to. The main thing for a shellfish farmer is to be able to place the product on the market. So the Harvesting Waters Directive is the one that we must comply with. And I think that the intention to try and bring those two standards into line will be tremendously helpful for us, because we'll be basing the quality of the environment on the quality of the shellfish that are coming from the environment, and making that link is something that hasn't been done before. There's been a disconnect between water quality and shellfish quality when actually they are one and the same thing.
Okay, Stephen Cameron.
Just to again follow on from Jenny's point, and probably adding a bit to what's been said. I think as industry we would accept Jenny's point on Grade A classification for a number of, if you like, non-pollutant events or controlled pollutant events, but I don't know how relevant it is to this actual discussion, but there is a lot around the interpretation of EU legislation that commercially impinges on water classification and Grade A status in Scotland. I'm not, to be fair, I'm not sure how relevant it is to this bill, but it certainly is impacted and relevant in terms of Grade A classification.
Question from Jane Baxter.
Do the witnesses agree with Scottish Water's evidence that it has done much work to resolve water quality problems originating from its network, and that diffuse agricultural pollution may be responsible? How would the bill help to resolve this?
I could go first on that one. I think that we obviously have had many interesting debates with Scottish Water. One of the things that I find strange in some of the evidence for this bill is the amount of money that they have allocated against protection of shellfish growing waters. Shellfish growers are not the only people who want waters to be free of pollutants, and I think that just because money has been spent in an area which is adjacent to shellfish waters, the bill shouldn't be laid on our door exclusively for that. So we have a few issues with the way with that. But we are back to diffuse pollution. I think something that Scottish Water have control over certain assets of their own. There are things out there that Scottish Water don't have control over, and they look to CEPA. So someone mentioned septic tanks. That is nothing to do with Scottish Water. There is, I think, another bit of legislation going through somewhere to try and catch up and pick up with all these unregulated or unlicensed discharges. But I think we can't be too specific or too hard on Scottish Water in some respects, because in the natural environment, our classifications are measured on E. coli, and E. coli comes from any warm-blooded mammal. So the whole sampling process is not really perfect. It is flawed, and something as simple as a passing seagull at the time that you were taking your sample can have an impact. So there is a balance to be struck, but I think we would want to work more closely with Scottish Water. I think it would be helpful to get out of the defensive, argumentative situation we sometimes find ourselves in, and to work more pragmatically together for a practical solution.
Yes, Peter Pollard.
Yeah, can I first make the point that there's almost two sides to thinking about what we do for shellfish waters as a country. One side is we try and ensure the environmental conditions are suitable for the shellfish growth, so it protects the shellfish themselves. And the second bit, which I think the industry is most interested in, is managing particularly indicators of fecal contamination because of the marketing issues around that. So the fecal contamination doesn't do any damage to the shellfish themselves, but it is an issue for marketing the shellfish. If we look at our waters across Scotland, all our shellfish waters are in a good state in relation to the growth of shellfish in terms of the ecological quality of the water. And the problem is the fecal coliforms. And as Jennifer said, they can get into the water from a number of sources, not just sewage-related sources, but also from agricultural activities, If you've got a river draining into the sea that's going through an intensively farmed bit of agricultural land, or even an extensively farmed area with lots of sheep droppings, that can be a source. Also, seal haul-out areas, rafts of seagulls. And I think in terms of deciding where and what action is needed, the first step is to apportion where the problem's coming from. Work out what sources are contributing to the problem. It might not always be Scottish Water assets. It might be some other source. And we need to if we want to be effective at our management, we need to work out what the source is. And that's, I think, the process going forward of how we manage these areas.
Craig Burton first.
It's, it may assist the committee to know that Seafish have, working with the water industry in England in particular at the moment, on a text alert system whereby if they do get a discharge from some of their water treatment works, a text message goes out to shellfish growers in that particular area to alert them to the fact that they may need to step up their testing for their end product standards and things like this. And it's an initiative that certainly growers in Scotland are interested in. And it would be sort of helpful to maybe get into a good dialogue with Scottish Water on this as to how that might be taken forward in the future. It certainly seems to have had a very good reception so far where it is being trialled. And it is early days, but it does look positive so far.
Stephen Cameron, on this point? Okay.
I've never had a point to make.
You didn't? Okay. Graham Day would like to ask a supplementary.
Just to pick up on Walter Spears' point, just to clarify, you referred to the situation with Scottish Water. Is the problem lack of engagement with them, or is it the nature of the engagement?
I think it's the nature of the engagement. I think, to be perfectly frank, we find ourselves in a situation where the Scottish Water are perhaps don't want to be as open as they could be in case someone comes after them for compensation, and that's something we've really got to move forward from. You know, I think if Scottish Water were to alert a shellfish farmer that there had been a spill and therefore the shellfish farm couldn't sell their produce, I suppose that does leave the door open to the shellfish farm going back to Scottish Water and making some sort of claim against a loss of sales. If we could get that scenario out of the way and actually work together more productively, there's a lot of positive things that Scottish Water could do to help us jointly move forward on this. And it would be helpful to have a more open discussion without that fear of some sort of litigation.
Jennifer Howie wanted to come in on the general point.
Well, it's a general point. I just would like to make the point that the commercial marketing point aside, which is of course of keen interest to the industry, there's absolutely nothing wrong with shellfish from Class B water. In fact, from a public health perspective, anything from Class B water has an additional public health control that it doesn't ensure anything, but it provides an additional safeguard in terms of public health protection, which shellfish from Class A waters don't have to go through. In fact, if anything, there's a bigger onus on producers from shellfish waters, Class A shellfish waters, to demonstrate that their product is compliant, because there's no absolute control that the shellfish from such areas has to undergo before it can be marketed. There's nothing wrong with Class B waters and shellfish from those waters.
Yes, Stephen.
I agree with that point, Jenny, and the process that you're talking about in terms of depuration or cooking, I totally agree. However, commercially, the perception would be that Class A would be better than Class B. And others in the EU work very hard to maintain a Class A status. And the points that you make are correct, Jenny, around, our Class B is probably cleaner and probably safer than the Class A, but it is this perception, and it is not helpful to industry. I think there maybe is another forum and another area where we can try to deal with that, and I know through other forums we are looking at it, but, that's the science and that's the industry view, so that's where we are.
Okay. Do we have another question in this series? I'd like to know will the FSA and SEPA monitoring and inspection regimes be fully aligned under the new process? Yep.
This is taking it out with the scope of the bill to a certain extent, but as the committee might be aware, the Food Standards Agency in Scotland will become something else in a few years' time, and Scottish Government will be launching a consultation on exactly the roles and responsibilities from a Food Standards Agency perspective that this new food body will embody and have within its remit. So that'll provide another avenue for looking at exactly the sort of overlap between other bits of government from an FSA perspective.
Anyone else? Yes, Peter Pollard.
Just add that we are working closely together already. In fact, a lot of SEPA's classifications of shellfish growing areas rely on data provided by FSA to us from their sampling of harvesting areas. And we supplement that where there are gaps, for example, because there's no harvesting area at the time, etc. So we are already working that way, and I see that continuing as it's...
Jennifer, Howie?
I'd just like to echo our sentiments on that too. We do work well together, and I think forums such as the Shellfish Forum have been a benefit to the regulators and our dealings with industry in terms of having a regimented, quarterly meeting just to catch up on relevant points.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, given the need for this definition of shellfish waters, about how it relates, for example, to fish farm management areas that we're talking about in other parts of the bill, and indeed to meet marine protected areas which are not within the mischief of the bill, but are indeed something which is going to be overarching. And I wondered if any of you as witnesses had views about that just now. Yes?
Yep. Well, sorry, I'm involved in the ongoing debate about marine protected areas. I think one of the marine protected areas, there is an element of pressures, different pressures that come on, and one of those is from sewage. So whilst there are pressures from the effects of aquaculture, there is also the protection from sewage causing damage to these areas. So that is kind of aligned, and I'm quite glad to see that in there. It does help. What we do have concerns about, and haven't fully been resolved yet, is what permitted activity, or what will be permitted activities within marine protected areas. And we very hope that something like shellfish farming, which is pretty benign, would be permitted in a marine protected area. Part of the important thing about having our shellfish growing waters designated with a capital D, if you like, is it means that they are already a designated area. And if an area is to be considered for a marine protected area, it will have to take into account the fact the area is already designated as a shellfish growing water. So we're quite keen to keep this designation in the shape that it has been in the Shellfish Growing Waters Directive.
Craig Burton.
It's really within marine protected areas, certainly, we've been putting together a sort of a toolkit that will aid the industry in gathering its own data in support of its case for continuing or moving into new areas and new activities, to do environmental assessments, to help with appropriate assessments. And we're very keen to see that the decision-making process will actually allow that to be submitted in support of an application, because there is a general view that, well, if that's industry data, it can't be right, and we should employ an external consultant at quite a lot of money to actually do the same thing in less time and with less thoroughness. The industry is there day in, day out. They know their environment, they know what they're doing, and they're a very, very good source of this sort of information and things like that. With moving on to the farm management agreements, obviously within the bill, there's no requirement for shellfish farms to actually be part of an area management agreement or farm management agreement sort of system that is aimed solely really at the fish farming industry. There is a slight concern that it may catch up some of the minority fish species that we farm, such as halibut and maybe cod if it returns to Scottish waters, and maybe even turbot, which makes guest appearances every now and then goes back off to Spain and then comes back again every now and then. So it's just that maybe there could be an unintended consequence if they're not actually spelt out. We can understand why farm management agreements are there. They make a lot of sense from the point of view of the salmon industry and to a certain extent sea trout farming industry. But for some of the other species, it's maybe of less importance, but it would be good to make sure that they don't just get caught up by an unintended consequence too much.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I have another question, particularly. Peter Paul?
Just add one thing to add on that. I think one of the benefits of highlighting areas important for example, shellfish or marine protection for conservation reasons is that it helps in prioritising your efforts. We have to manage the whole of Scotland's water environments, but we have to put more effort in some areas where they need more improvement. And I think these kind of identifying what's important to the country help us, certainly as managers of the water environment, put efforts appropriately.
In your case, that's out to 3 mile
That's
from
correct.
the shore.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So there could be much larger areas than that, marine protected areas. So there's an overlap there. Okay. I thought it was worth exploring that. I have a specific question perhaps that Walter Spears might like to respond to. In Part 1, Chapter 3 of the Bill on commercially damaging species, in the introduction he said they might be affected by Mytilus trocellus. Could you expand on that?
Yep, happy to do so. Loch Etive was Scotland's most productive shellfish loch, and at the time of this problem hitting us, we were producing around about 1,000 tonnes or 800 something tonnes. And then we noticed something had changed about the mussels. They had a very thin shell, a very small meat content. We at first thought there was some environmental factor, and that was the first line of pursuit, was there something, was there too many shellfish, etc., in the water and not enough of the nutrients. And then completely by chance we had some visitors from Canada who identified very quickly this as being another species. So we now know that the species is Mytilus trocellus. Something that was probably not correct in the spice briefing that I read about Mytilus trocellus was it was decided that it was a native species. It may have been a native species here during the Ice Age, but no evidence of it has ever been found since, other than on mussel farms. So I would not agree with the fact that it's a native species. However, we did at one point try to get it considered an INS, an invasive non-native species. But it can't be classed as an invasive non-native species because it's not displacing a native species and it's not destroying a habitat. So we're left with this situation where we have something that doesn't fit into any category and there are no mechanisms to control it. So I'm really, really happy to see the start of some sort of ability of somebody in the Scottish Government or SEPA being able to take some action to deal with something that is a problem that, unless it's dealt with, can continue to spread. So I think we've learned a lot through what's happened in Loch Etive, and hopefully we're learning how to manage it. And I'm glad to see that there are some powers hopefully going to be in place that, had they been in place earlier, would really have assisted us in our attempts to eradicate the species from Loch Etive.
Any other comments on that particular question? Okay, thank you for that. I look at that. We want to look now at shellfish orders and cockle fishing in the Solway, etc. And Alec Ferguson, local member, would like to...
Thank you, Convener. Indeed, as the member for Galloway and West Dumfries, this is a big issue, and with two South of Scotland members here as well, who will, I'm sure, be keen to ask questions. But before we come to the specifics of the Solway, the bill intends to make changes to the way that several and regulatory orders are put in place. And to a certain extent, it intends, I think, to simplify the process a bit. And I just wonder whether anybody wants to comment on whether they think this is an improvement, whether they think this is a good idea, and if so, whether there are further changes they would like to see, because certainly it is a long and lengthy process at the moment. And I just wonder if anybody wants to comment on the changes that are proposed.
I think anything that actually simplifies the process, maybe speeds it up and perhaps hopefully reduces the actual cost to an applicant, has got to be a positive measure. I understand the reluctance of certainly the catching sector, who have an inherent reluctance to consider fishery orders such as these because they see it as landlordism of the sea. Yes, maybe granting a right of several fishery or a regulated fishery to take a named species in a named area is a bit of landlordism. It could be considered that way. But as a practical basis, if you're looking to cultivate a species, use the natural environment, and things like this, you need a level of protection for what you're actually putting in there. It works for oysters, it works for mussels, it can work equally for cockles, razorfish, anything like that. There is a built-in mechanism to make sure you actually improve the stock and you don't just take it all and pillage it out. And you know, it's a very, very good mechanism, and we actually had the legislation extended to include crustaceous such as lobsters and crabs and things like that. And again, if you're actually going to do a lobster hatchery and stock an area, you need a mechanism to control who can go in there and take it out, because it's a considerable investment and that's being made. So anything that actually helps simplify it, cheapens the process, hopefully speeds it up, yeah, it's got to be a good thing, really.
Anybody else want to comment on that? Jim, do you? Sorry, I just wonder if any other member might want to talk on that before we move to the specifics, convener.
Do you want to come there? No.
Nope.
Please
Everybody
continue.
Happy. Right. I'm sure members, and I'm sure everybody around the table, or most people around the table, will be aware of the difficulties that have been faced on the Solway in terms of a cockle fishery over the last few years. And I would just reiterate, I think, whatever the differences might be about how it's been run, nobody wanted to see an unregulated fishery, that is for sure. The government is intending to put forward, this was not originally in the bill, but the government intends to put forward an amendment to make changes to both the Inshore Fisheries Scotland Act 1984 and the Sea Fisheries Shellfish Act 1967 to alter the circumstances that a court can take into account when considering a prosecution for illegal cockle fishing. And this has been a huge issue locally for, well, ever since the SSMA, Scottish Shellfish Management Association, ceased to function. And I'm very keen to know whether people feel that the changes that the government are proposing, whether the enforcement agencies here in particular feel that they will be effective in stopping the illegal fishery that takes place at the moment. And just by way of background, although there has been a big success recently through in the west of the region with the seizure of a great deal of gear, and I hope prosecutions will be brought. I have it on good authority that 4 tons of illegally poached cockles left Kirkcudbright Harbour this week under various documentations that's available. And just as a follow-up to that, if I may, convener, at a meeting that was held in Dumfries with all of the enforcement agencies, which I attended some months ago now, it became quite obvious that there was a lack of interagency working to tackle this particular problem. And there's a big food safety issue here, because if you've got illegal fish cockroach going into the food chain, there's potentially a problem. And I just wondered whether members could comment on, A, whether they think the changes the government is proposing will be enough to solve some of these problems, and B, whether there is room for better interagency working to tackle them.
David. Okay. Thank you, Chair. Yes, I would support what's being proposed here. In fact, I'd probably take it a stage further and split it into 2 separate parts. And I think we already have a good example of that under the Civic Government Scotland Act, where it relates to known thieves, where there is one section, Section 57, where it's where a person is found in circumstances where it's reasonable to infer they're there to commit theft. And then there's a second section, Section 58, where they're actually found in possession of tools from which it may be reasonably inferred they were there they were being used to commit crime. And I would do the same in terms of the cockle beds in the proposals here, because what we can find out on the cockle beds is that people discard the equipment that they're using to do the fishing, and they simply come ashore in their clothing, maybe with a headlamp if they're working at night, and therefore they don't have the nets, the tamper boards, the bags that would indicate that's what they were about. And I think that using expert knowledge, you'd be able to infer that they were there for that purpose. So that would be the first part. The second part simply speaks for itself in terms of if they're found in possession of the accoutrements, paraphernalia that would indicate that they either have been cockling or are about to go cockling, then the offence would be complete. So I would separate the two, which would give you a much more realistic opportunity of gaining a conviction within the courts. Moving on to the second point, in terms of interagency working, I think I would have to agree that in the early stages of this process there was a lack of understanding as to individual roles and responsibilities under the legislation. I think we've moved on since then. There have been a number of meetings that have taken place. There now are memorandums of understanding and information sharing protocols in place to ensure that we as the police share with not only Marine Scotland but with Environmental Health, Food Standards Agency as well, to ensure that any information we're getting is turned around on a real quick time basis and then shared with the other partners so that they can then take the enforcement action and respond to public concerns.
I wondered if I may convene, certainly at the meeting I referred to in Dumfries, SEPA were quite open about the fact that there was perhaps more they could do in terms of tracking down and monitoring movements of shellfish and trying to identify what was not legally caught. And I just wondered whether you might want to comment on that.
From the Food Standards Agency rather than SEPA?
Sorry, I meant
yes.
Food Standards. Forgive me, Food Standards Agency.
Well, I think key to it is the interagency working, and I think since that meeting, just to reiterate the point, I've had many discussions that I haven't had previously with various parties, various other enforcement authorities in relation to assisting in terms of providing clarity under food law, what we require and therefore what other people should look for if you happen upon some sort of activity that you might suspect to be illegal, and that's, I think, borne fruit. Yes, I think in terms of the requirements under food law, in terms of the sort of tracking and confirmation that that which is on the registration document, which is a requirement, which contains all the detail, which if accurately and honestly filled in, provides all you need to know about the shellfish that you've got in the back of your truck. It's down to a matter of trust on the one hand, whether indeed the paperwork itself is enough and whether in this modern digital age we can move to perhaps other requirements. Other fishery sectors have GPS tracking. I don't think it would be beyond the wit of agencies and fishermen in cockle fisheries to keep track of where they've been. It would help fill in the registration requirements in terms of identifying the bed that they've taken the fish from, to use your modern smartphone GPS systems to help you note where you've been. It kind of falls a little bit out with the Food Standards Agency's direct remit in terms of monitoring movements of fishermen generally, and therefore I think we would fall probably on the side of just more interagency work, more sort of intelligence sharing.
Sorry, could I just follow that up, Convener? It's not so much about the movement of fishermen, if you'll forgive me.
Not fishermen.
It's more about the movement of the actual product once it's been landed.
I apologise. Not the movement of the people themselves. It's about where it's from, and if you're hand gathering, somewhere at a certain time, the easiest way to track exactly where you've taken it from would probably be to just have your, switch on your GPS. It'd be quite easy to do it, and then you'd be able to demonstrate that's where it came from, and it's absolute, and you don't have to do any other work. It'd be easy nowadays to do that.
There is a paper trail that has to follow
there is a paper
any
trail.
product.
It's an old-fashioned paper trail under food hygiene regulations.
And it falls within your agency's responsibility to monitor that.
Yes, but there'll be other paper trails within other agencies that must be followed for, sustainability reasons and whatever else. But yes, and an original, sorry to go on, but an original of that document must accompany the batch at all times. Local authorities have limited enforcement capacity. They've got other priorities as well, so it does become an issue of striking when the iron's hot with the best intelligence gathered from all agencies.
Thank you.
Craig Burton wants to comment.
It was just a quick comment on really tracking folk on the ground and tracking where fisheries are being exploited. There are some very, very good systems available which do use mobile phone technologies. VMS is the shorthand version. And we're actually conducting some trials in Scotland on some small inshore vessels. But the current system, there is no reason why you can't bolt it to a quad bike, even a push bike if you wanted. And it just tracks and it uploads every 2 seconds a position of where the actual vehicle or whatever, or the vessel is, and what it's doing. It's tamper-proof, and we can provide a lot more information about it if you're interested.
Any further points on that? David McCallum? Yes.
Yes, Chair. I was going to say that a meeting on the 18th of October, which I think Mr Ferguson was at, where there was a multi-agency discussion around how you promote best practice on the cockle beds. There were fishermen, boat fishermen from the Thames estuary there who spoke about having that very equipment on their boats that they were having to use to track where the cockles were coming. So there are good examples out there currently which could be developed here in Scotland if we wanted to go down that road.
Jim?
Yeah, just to explore that further, Jennifer, how you mentioned that there is a paper trail which can be policed, but you mentioned that local authorities were didn't quite have the resource. I presume that's trading standards. Who is policing movement of shellfish or cockles or whatever at the moment? And I'd also like to see if there's any suggestions where, for example, there's 4 tonnes of cockles from Kirkcudbright. Is there any intelligence on how that is being marketed, allegedly?
In terms of enforcement of the food hygiene side of things, where the registration documentary requirements come from, it's local authorities that are the competent authority. And I should clarify, local authorities have the resources they have to deal with all food issues. It just might be a case of, prioritisation at any one point as to whether they can devote resources to a particular alleged crime or whatever under the hygiene regulations. And the second point, sorry?
I think it was more on it's maybe not for yourself, just on the intelligence, if there is any, of where these illegal cockles are going. I mean, we're talking fairly large tonnages. Has there been cases that there have been any prosecutions in the past, or is it very difficult to prosecute? And how could we help with that? It's maybe one for somebody else, but
I would suggest that the material will end up on the continent. There's not a tremendous UK home market for those sort of volumes of cockles. So, yeah.
Howie?
Just to say that in terms of the point that product is placed on the market, it must be, under food hygiene law, placed on the market at an approved premises. So really, whilst it can move to the continent, it would have to move to an approved premises, unless, of course, that's not happening, or somebody in an approved premises is covering up the documentary trail. So, I mean, we've had quite interesting discussions about the point at which enforcement agencies should maybe follow up on allegations. Approved premises are fixed land-based organisations, and if there's a suggestion that, there's perhaps cockles being lifted and moved somewhere via a premises, then, there are premises there that might have knowledge about where things are going. It's easier perhaps to go to the fixed land premises rather than fishermen at night that are difficult to track.
I would agree.
Stephen Cameron.
And certainly land-based facilities in which we occupy, that's quite manageable. There are countless trucks that just go back and forth, 24 hours a day, and probably in this case under cover of darkness. I would suggest that would be extremely difficult for anybody to try and police and manage.
Yeah.
Jump on that point, it mentioned about sort of traceability, something in the agricultural world that has been electronified, is that a word? That's not a word, but never mind, you know what I mean, digitalised, if you like. And Jennifer, how we mentioned the paper trail, would the actual industry prefer an electronic system where it's all automatically done and you don't have to fill in paperwork for their supply chain?
In response to that, Jim, the answer would be yes, if we could get there. I think the holy grail for everybody, if we could spend less time in paperwork. But To be fair, I think for, and I believe the vast majority of businesses are law-abiding and upstanding, the trail and the paperwork trail and the systems that we have in place work pretty well to regulate our industry. And if you are dealing with like-minded customers, and I can certainly speak slight digression, but for our industry it's predominantly UK retail, I can assure you that the traceability requirements are extremely onerous, and the system works for people who are not trying to work out with the system.
David McCallum.
Certainly, Chair. I would back up Mr Hume's concerns there around about traceability, and perhaps if I can give an example, is that only this week in Stranraer a significant quantity of cockles were stolen from a shed of a fisherman there. Now, they must have gone into the market at some point, but how you then quality assure them, reduce the risk for the public who may buy them, I don't know, but there's a significant concern there as to where those cockles have gone. Now, one can only presume they've gone to the black market with nothing to trace where they've came from. So absolutely a concern about proper procedures in place to trace the movement of cockles in particular. And going on to a further point, Mr Hume was asking about prosecutions. Again, last week we worked together with Marine Scotland in dealing with a case down at Powfoot near Annan, which is another of the cockle beds where there have been problems before. And in fact, the individual who allowed us access to the land is probably the gentleman who's made reference to in Annex 1. And we were able to secure the cockles, secure the evidence, which will allow Marine Scotland to take a prosecution forward there. And again, we're working very closely with the Gang Masters Licensing Authority in terms of a problematic individual from Dumfries, in terms of his involvement in the cockle beds, particularly around the Sand Green area. And my understanding is that the Gang Masters Licensing Authority are currently working with the dedicated wildlife prosecutor in Dumfries, the Procurator Fiscal's office there, to bring a case against that individual. So there is work ongoing, and there is good collaborative work ongoing, which hopefully will lead to the prosecutions that people are looking to see as a result of the illegal activities going on.
Thanks. On a supplementary on that point, Graham Day and then Dick Lyon.
Thank you. You've partially answered the question I was going to raise, because there are a number of members around this table who don't represent areas where this is a particularly big issue. So I think for our benefit, I'd be quite interested to hear about the practical problems you encounter in trying to catch these people in the act. Presumably it's quite resource intensive for the police and for Marine Scotland. How much help do you get from other sources, the legal shellfish industry, members of the public? What are the practicalities of this issue?
In terms of where we get help from, I think we have excellent support from the communities right round the Solway in terms of reporting what they suspect to be illegal activity. Members may not be aware, but the beds in the Solway are currently closed, and yet hand gathering continues, and that's the predominant method of taking cockles. But there also has been boats that can extract them with boats, and that has taken place in the past. In terms of the difficulties, the Solway is an extremely dangerous estuary, very fast-moving tides, unpredictable sands, and to put officers out onto the cockle beds themselves, I think would be very difficult around health and safety. We don't have the skills, the knowledge that would allow us just to go out there and do that. So it makes it very difficult, because it actually talks about and when the beds are open, it's about taking the fish at the point of source, as opposed to being found with them on the land. So that makes it particularly difficult. In terms of boats, again, it would be very difficult for us to do any enforcement from a policing perspective, because we don't have the equipment that will allow us to go out there and do the checks. And that's why the enforcement principally lies with Marine Scotland, supported by ourselves, because they have the expertise, the equipment and the ability to go out and do that. The two things are very difficult to actually catch them in the act, because of the risks involved to personnel. We get the support from the community, which allows us to gather evidence on shore, which we then supply to Marine Scotland to allow them to take forward prosecutions.
On that point, Craig Burton and then Dick Lyle has a question.
It's really just widening things out a little bit. I can understand the emphasis on cockles in the Solway is a particularly intractable problem at the present moment, but there is actually illegal gathering of other shellfish species that takes place within Scotland, particularly native oysters and winkles. They are unregulated, it's highly mobile, it's an itinerant population quite often. They do make their way into the marketplace. There's probably a little bit of creative paperwork, shall we say, goes on to accompany them to, for all intents and purposes legalise them. But it's not just the cockles that are actually being gathered illegally out there. There are other species in other areas, but it's transient, it's small, it's very mobile, it's very difficult to police.
David McCann.
We are also seeing now problems with razor fishing. And again, it's the point at which the fish are taken, where the offence is committed. And again, it's boat-based. And we really do struggle to be able to do anything with that, given the lack of ability and skills on the part of ourselves as an organisation.
Just to add, really, certainly. Go back to David's very first point. The regulated industry works extremely hard to avoid any potential food safety issues, all year. It's a difficult enough marketplace to operate in, and the risk of unregulated, perhaps toxic, contaminated shellfish is really, really potentially damaging to the 99% the industry that works very hard to follow regulation and ensure safe shellfish get to the marketplace. Just to add to that.
Okay. Thank you. Dick Lyle.
Convener, I found this discussion very interesting. It sounds like something out of the American prohibition. But can I ask, on the point to Jennifer Howie, if we have regulation and we have paper regulation, if I went to get a driving licence, I can't steal one. Right? You may get fakes, but I'm sure the police can search that out. So if we have regulation and paper regulation, and if we go into digital or whatever, how can someone who's an established trader falsify paperwork? That's the point I'd like cleared up.
The first step is to have the paperwork, and then you have to make the bold step to falsify it. And I think in a great many cases, it's less about. Sorry, I'm going off your specific point for the moment. Well,
if I can draw you back
right,
on,
okay, sure. Well,
draw you back on to the point I'm trying to make. If we have established traders who are trading,
yeah.
and I'm sure cockles are the best in the world from Scotland, but if we have an established trader, and then we have gangsters or people who are not established, how do they get the correct paperwork? Or how do they falsify it?
In terms of what the regulation requires, the requirement legally falls to the food business to provide the registration document with the details outlined in legislation filled in. In practice, local authorities issue registration documents largely, and they don't tend to issue them individually just because of the bureaucratic, the amount of paperwork and toings and froings and the cost that involves. So there's, to legitimate businessmen, business people and to fishermen, they will issue a pad. They will issue a pad in certain cases. In terms of how you might then falsify the information on it, I'll provide an example. I'll use the razorfish example. If we classify an area for razorfish, it's a defined area of sea. We'll award it a classification which is specific to that area. If somebody fishes somewhere else and wishes to falsify the paperwork, they could fill in the document and claim it came from the classified area, because unless we've got people sitting, watching, and we've got witnesses to the act of taking it from somewhere else, then it's exceptionally difficult to prove.
So it really comes down to the point, Convener, that we need to try and regulate this some way or try and solve it, because it's certainly a problem.
We'll reflect on that for sure. Alec Ferguson had a point to follow up, did you?
It's a sort of similar point, if I may. Thank you, very briefly. And it really stems from something that Jennifer Howie said earlier on, which is that and this probably sounds obvious, I suppose, but I thought it was very relevant that it's much easier to police and monitor land-based operations than it is to shore-based and sea-based. And the fact is, David McCallum's quite right, a lot of the onus for this falls on Marine Scotland. The one point I think we have to note, or it'd be worthy of noting, is that Marine Scotland are not based locally. We have a local police force at the moment, but we don't have a local Marine Scotland base. They're a long way away, although they are stepping up activity in the area. But it did strike me that the committee might want to look further as we go through this bill at how we better police and monitor the land-based activities, because the fact is, and it's become very obvious around the table today, that there is illegal product getting into the food chain. And you try to do that in the agricultural world, as Jim Hume pointed out, you will have considerable difficulty. And yet it seems to be quite possible in the world of sea fish. That cannot be right. And I think we need to look a bit further at that. And I simply say that.
Walter Spears, first of all.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to add that we need to be quite careful that we don't have unintended consequences here, and that we have more regulation falling on the good guys. And the danger of tightening up is that's a clear danger. And an example of that would be that our sector technically falls within the remit of the gangmasters. Now, we're trying very hard to get out of that because we don't think we should be within the remit of the gangmasters legislation, but we are, and we have to work with Westminster on that because it's UK legislation. But that's an unintended consequence of people illegally gathering cockles has brought the threat of another bit of regulation to the good sector.
Okay. And Craig Burton?
It's just the one that it's very easy to look at our home-based industries, our land-based facilities, and go and police them. But they're the ones that are operating legally in most cases. We know of instances where illegally gathered product has made it all the way as far as Italy and places like that before it's been spotted that it hasn't actually got the right paperwork. So if you want to operate under the radar, you don't go anywhere near actually declaring any paperwork in the UK, and you send it out in a wagon. And I mean, for the Italians to actually pick it up is actually pretty good because they're not necessarily noted for their paperwork trails themselves. But, you know, it can make it all that way.
David McCallum.
I was going to pick up on what Craig had said there. I know, for example, within the south of Scotland, that there is an Irish producer leaves a refrigerated lorry sitting at the side of the road where the fishermen deposit their catch for him to then take to Ireland. And again, when it's boat-based as well, you have boats operating in the Solway, which are landing in England and may also be landing in the Republic of Ireland. So that there could be catches coming from the Solway, and looking at the Solway just in its own right, there could be catches being landed in Scotland, England, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland as well, and how you manage and control that, I think, needs a piece of joined-up working to ensure that safety of product.
Claudia Beamish.
Thank you. You know, just on that point, I wonder if I could just pursue that a little further and ask you about the interagency working with the Customs Agency, with Her Majesty's Customs.
We have strong relationships with them, but again, it's what role that they have to play within the management of shellfish. I've got to be honest with you and say I don't know. We do have information sharing protocols, and I think that Customs were a partner organisation who we dealt with in recent weeks when looking at the ill-treatment of fishermen and foreign nationals, and they were part of the enforcement group who targeted that particular facet of the fishing industry. So there are working relationships there, but where they are in terms of cockle fishing, I honestly couldn't give you an answer there.
Through the convener, I think the point that would be of interest would perhaps be in relation to what paperwork has to be shown if something's going out of the country. And I'm not necessarily asking for the answer from yourself at all, but just to sort of have clarification on that.
Yes, I may think I would probably refer you back to Jennifer. It's probably a Food Standards Agency issue, given that they deal with the paperwork side of it as opposed to us as the police. And maybe Marine Scotland may have an answer to that, again, as the principal enforcement agency as well.
Jennifer Howie.
Just to say, in the last couple of weeks, HMRC have actually been in touch with us, and we'll be having a meeting in the new year just about exactly that, what they should look for in terms of the paperwork from a food hygiene perspective.
Well, thank you. We've had a good round table on that to reflect on in due course. And now move on to the question of fixed penalty notices. Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. This kind of ties in a way to the previous discussion. Members of the panel will be aware that Section 51 of the Bill amends Section 25 of the 2007 Act to widen the cases in which Marine Scotland can issue fixed penalty notices, and basically extends the provisions to all marine and freshwater fisheries related offences which are the responsibility of Marine Scotland. I'd be interested to hear if members of the panel have concerns with regard to the section on charging, or indeed the introduction of fixed penalty notices as far as they could relate to shellfish farming and sea fisheries. Anybody?
Certainly under Section 50, the provision to actually introduce charging for fisheries and aquaculture provision of services, or however you wish to sort of put it, it is obviously a concern that was raised with us by industry, the fact that we appreciate this is sort of an enabling legislation, that it might put it in, but the problem is, from a business point of view, you're asking almost for a blank check. It's the fact that you're not going to say what you want to charge for, and you're not going to say how much you're going to charge for it, or the mechanism that you're going to put in place for establishing what you're going to charge for it. You're just going to go for cost recovery, or you're going to go for cost plus, or what other mechanisms are you're going to go out there? Admittedly, when you look round some other countries in the world, they think the situation in Scotland and the UK is atypical because we provide it as under the public sort of remit, whereas other countries, yes, if you want to land a box of fish, you are charged for landing that box of fish and getting it certified as a separate sort of cost and things like this. So there's pluses and minuses, but from a business point of view, it's a very uncertain thing to be asked to sign up for when you don't know what it means.
Any other points on that? Walter Spears.
It's a bit vague as to what they would actually be. I mean, I think Marine Scotland carry out certain duties that are EU legislation and not really anything that's of any benefit to us, but something they have to do. I think Food Standards Agency have a similar remit, and they have things that they have to do as statutory from EU. For those charges to get passed back to industry, they could be disproportionate to the profit margins in some small businesses, and I think that's just we have to be careful that we didn't start passing charges back which were non-specific, if you like, from large organisations, which would really cripple small businesses.
Okay, thank you very much.
Clearly, it does need greater clarity, Convener, so that's something that we can pick up in our report.
Thank you for that, Angus MacDonald. Nigel Don, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Perhaps one question to all the panellists. I'm just wondering whether there's a case for different regulation for different species of shellfish, and whether anybody feels that one size fits all is maybe where we are and maybe we shouldn't be. Do we want to distinguish between oysters, cockles?
I think there's the differences that we have at the moment is cultivated versus wild. Mm-hmm. So cockles for me is a fishery, and so it's not part of my remit. But I think it's most shellfish produced in Scotland from aquaculture is quite tightly regulated. I think a lot of the problems we've had are more from fisheries rather than from aquaculture. We're pretty tight. The only thing I would say that sometimes we have mussels and oysters classed together in food standards terms because they're both bivalve molluscs. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that's a bit challenging, but then that's not probably part of this bill.
No, okay. But if it's very close to this bill, then maybe, given that we're here at the moment, maybe it's an issue we could just consider. Are there the lack of response suggests to me that there aren't any overwhelming concerns. Response, yes.
There are sort of times when the legislation as it's framed, and sometimes even it actually comes maybe more under the EU than some of our legislation. Scallops, the scallop cultivators have a particular problem at the moment insofar as the premium for them lies in putting a live in-shell product onto the market, which is extremely difficult to do under the current legislation around biotoxins. The whole animal, if you sort of take it and mince it up and then test for biotoxin levels, the chances are it may well be over permitted levels for some biotoxins for most of the year, Whereas if you actually break it down to the component parts that you actually eat, particularly the white adductor muscle and or the gonad, then certainly the white adductor muscle is probably well under any permitted biotoxin levels virtually all the year round. The gonad may be periods when, yes, that will be above permitted levels. There are other periods when it's below permitted levels, and it's just a simple matter to remove it if it's above, and things like that. And that's one where it's a bit like the analogy if you wanted to sort of put a whole sheep on the market, you have to mince the whole sheep up and then sort of test that to see whether it complies with food legislation. The chances are it would fail. And it's just these little anomalies that do arise. It's an intractable problem. It's under EU regulations for biotoxins, and but it takes away that premium that they rely on to actually be able to farm scallop. If you put it into the general shucking market, that premium vanishes and your margin just takes a nosedive. Jennifer Howie?
I must admit, those sorts of issues, there are issues about different species and how things are monitored, but I don't have any comment in terms of the bill's impact on that. I think it's under food hygiene legislation, and on scallops, actually, the FSA is committed to undertaking a policy review on the sale of whole scallops, so that will be in the new year.
Very good. Okay, well, I'd like to thank all our witnesses for what's been a thorough session in an area which perhaps is less contentious, but throws out many more areas for us to report upon, because the consequences and unintended consequences of the discussions today are things which we'll want to look at very carefully. So thank you very much, all of you, for your contributions. As noted earlier, this is the committee's last meeting in 2012. The next meeting will take place on January the 9th, 2013, where the committee will take evidence from the Minister on the Aquaculture-and-Fisheries-Bill Scotland. So may I take this opportunity to thank everyone who's played a part in the committee's business over this year, and on behalf of the members wish everyone all the best for Christmas and the New Year. And in particular to thank Katrina Marsden from SPICE, who has provided us with many briefings over this time, who's now going off to pastures new. Thank you very much, Katrina, and thank you very much, everybody. I suspend the meeting now, and we will move into private session after a short break.